My name is Claire Matthews. I'm 32 years old, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, a city where everybody seems to know everybody and word travels faster than the tide. I never thought my name, my story, would be spoken beyond the circle of people I've known my whole life. And I certainly never thought I'd be sitting here, recounting moments I once treasured, knowing now what they truly meant. But this is Unfaithful Chronicles. And if you've ever been in love, truly in love, maybe my story will sound uncomfortably familiar. Because betrayal doesn't always show up as a dramatic explosion. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing the same face you've kissed goodnight 1,000 times. I met Daniel Ross on a rainy Thursday in March of 2018. That day is burned into my memory, not because anything spectacular happened, but because it felt ordinary. And that's the thing about life. The moments that change everything rarely announce themselves. I'd been running late all morning, missed my alarm, spilled coffee on my blouse. Traffic on King Street was at a standstill. By the time I finally ducked into that little coffee shop on East Bay, I was soaked, cold, and desperately needing a moment to breathe. Daniel was there. I noticed him before he noticed me. Or maybe he did notice, but he was good at pretending otherwise. He sat in the corner, typing on his laptop with the kind of focus that makes you think, that person must be important. When I scanned the room for a seat, the only one left was across from him, by the rain-streaked window. He glanced up, smiled, not in a forced, polite way, but as if he'd been expecting me. "Looks like it's you and me," he said, gesturing toward the chair. We talked. About nothing. About everything. About how Charleston's weather can turn on you in an instant. How the best pizza in town isn't actually in town at all, but out in a little roadside spot only locals know about. He had this way of asking questions that made me want to keep talking. When I left that coffee shop, I had his number saved under Daniel, coffee shop, and an unexpected lightness in my chest. The next few weeks were a blur of messages, late-night calls, and small moments that felt bigger than they should have. He'd send me photos of his lunch just to make me laugh, or call to say goodnight even if he was out with friends. It was charming, attentive, the kind of attention you secretly hope for but never admit out loud. Our first real date was at a seafood place down by the harbor. I remember him reaching across the table to brush a strand of hair from my face. The kind of small gesture you don't think much about until you're lying in bed that night, smiling in the dark. Within months, he met my parents. My dad liked him. That's saying something. Daniel shook his hand firmly, looked him in the eye. My mom? She adored him instantly. We settled into a rhythm. Sunday walks on the waterfront. Dinner at my place on Tuesdays because he knew I hated cooking after work. Weekend drives to nowhere in particular. Windows down, music up. I thought, this is it. I thought I'd finally found the person who would be my safe place. But there were moments, small, almost invisible, that didn't quite fit. One night, I called him after work. It rang once, then straight to voicemail. I didn't hear back until morning. "Sorry," he said. "My phone died." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Another time I asked about his coworkers after he mentioned a night out with them. He smiled, but his eyes shifted, just slightly, before he changed the subject. And then there was the text. We were sitting on my couch, watching a movie, when his phone lit up on the coffee table. Just a name I didn't recognize. Before I could read the message, his hand moved, fast, locking the screen. He didn't even acknowledge it, just reached for his drink and kept watching. I told myself these were nothing. That's what trust does. It pavents over cracks until you convince yourself they aren't there. On Unfaithful Chronicles, you'll hear this again and again. People don't ignore the signs because they're foolish. They ignore them because they're in love, and love is loud enough to drown out everything else. If you'd asked me then, I would have sworn Daniel Ross was the one. He was attentive, kind, funny in a way that made me laugh until my ribs hurt. He told me I was beautiful without makeup. He remembered the little things I said in passing, surprising me with them later as if to prove he'd been listening all along. But there's a truth I learned too late. The version of someone you fall in love with isn't always the version you end up with, and sometimes you never really knew them at all. The night everything changed, it started just like any other. I'll tell you about it, because for you to understand what happened, why I still can't sleep with my bedroom door unlocked, you need to know how much I trusted him, how much I had to lose. If you think you'd see it coming, stay with me. This is only the beginning. And here on Unfaithful Chronicles, the beginnings are always the part that hurt the most. It was around the 6-month mark when I started noticing shifts. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, that's the moment it all changed. It was more like the air between us had grown heavier, though I couldn't explain why. Daniel started saying he was working late. At first, it made sense. His job in marketing often had last-minute campaigns, client emergencies, the kind of unpredictable hours I'd heard him complain about before. But it wasn't just once or twice a month. It became a pattern. One week, 3 of our usual dinners were canceled. Another week, he skipped our Sunday waterfront walk, something we had never missed since the day we met. When I asked about it, he smiled that same easy smile, said, "I'm sorry, babe. I promise I'll make it up to you." And I believed him, because I wanted to. But there was something else, his phone. In the early days, his phone would sit on the table between us while we ate, buzzing with the occasional message. He never seemed to care if I saw it. Sometimes, he'd even hand it to me to check the time or change the music. Now, it was different. It was always in his pocket or face down on the table. When it did light up, his hand was there instantly, locking it before I could even register the name on the screen. The first time I asked, "Who's that?" He said it was just a coworker. The second time, he laughed it off, kissing me on the forehead, as if my question was too silly to answer. I told myself I was overthinking. That's what trust is, right? You don't interrogate the person you love. You give them space. But in the quiet moments, when I was brushing my teeth at night or lying awake while he was working late, I felt it. That low hum in my chest. The feeling that something was wrong, even if I couldn't prove it. And then my friends started noticing. One Saturday, I met my best friend Rachel for lunch. We'd known each other since middle school. She has this uncanny ability to see through me, even when I'm trying to hide. We were halfway through our salads when she leaned forward and said, "Claire, you've been different lately, and not the good kind of different." I tried to laugh it off, but she didn't smile. She said she'd seen Daniel downtown one night when he was supposed to be at the office. He wasn't alone. She didn't know the woman, and she didn't want to jump to conclusions. But the way he was standing with her, leaning in close, talking with his hands, it didn't look like work. I told Rachel there had to be an explanation. I even convinced myself for a moment that she was mistaken. But her words wouldn't leave me. They sat in the back of my mind repeating, until they started to sound less like suspicion and more like truth. That week, I noticed something else. Daniel started avoiding certain topics altogether. If I mentioned plans for the future, trips we talked about, the idea of maybe moving in together, he changed the subject. If I asked about his friends, the ones I'd met before, He'd give short answers as if he didn't want me to know where he'd been or who he'd been with. And yet, every time he looked at me with those warm brown eyes, part of me still melted. Because love isn't a switch you can turn off when things don't feel right. It's a weight you carry, even when it starts to hurt. I told myself maybe this was just what happens in relationships, that maybe the early perfect stage had passed and we were just settling into real life. But deep down, I knew. Somewhere beneath all the excuses and reassurances, I knew there was a truth waiting to surface. And that when it did, I might not recognize the man standing in front of me anymore. This is Unfaithful Chronicles, and if you've been where I was, you already know. Once the cracks start to show, they don't close again, they widen. It was a Thursday. Not that Thursdays meant anything special to us, but looking back, I can still feel the way the air pressed against me that evening. Heavy, humid, like the city was holding its breath. Daniel called just before sunset. His voice was casual, maybe too casual. "Hey babe, I'm gonna be out with some friends tonight. Don't wait up, okay?" On the surface, it was nothing unusual. He'd gone out without me before. Friends, co-workers, the occasional late dinner. But there was something in the way he said it this time. Clipped, quick, almost rehearsed. I asked who he was going out with. He hesitated for just a second too long. "Just the guys from work," he said. "You wouldn't know them." And that's when it happened. That sharp, cold drop in my stomach. The one that says, "Pay attention." The one you can ignore in the daylight, but not when it follows you into the dark. I tried to shake it off. I made tea, put on a movie, told myself not to be that person, the one who doesn't trust without reason. But the minutes stretched, and my mind kept replaying Rachel's words from weeks before. The image of Daniel downtown, leaning in toward a woman she didn't know. By 9 o'clock, I couldn't sit still. I told myself I just needed to go for a drive, clear my head. But even as I grabbed my keys, I knew that wasn't the truth. I wasn't going for a drive. I was following my gut. The streets were slick from an earlier rain. Streetlights reflected in long, trembling lines across the asphalt. I didn't even know exactly where I was headed. I just knew the places Daniel liked to go when he was with the guys. The first bar I checked was nearly empty. The second was loud, crowded, but he wasn't there. I could have gone home. I almost did. But something in me, stubborn, aching, restless, told me to keep going. Around 10:15, I turned down a narrow street I rarely used. It was lined with old brick buildings, the kind that looked like they belonged in another century. Halfway down, I saw a small restaurant I didn't recognize. Warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk from tall windows, and through the glass. I froze. At first, I wasn't sure. The angle wasn't perfect, and the crowd inside made it hard to see clearly. But then, there he was, Daniel, only not Daniel. Not the man who brushed my hair back on our first date, or who made my mother laugh over coffee on Sunday mornings. This version of him was, I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for my hands to go cold, for my throat to tighten until I could barely swallow. Long enough to realize that walking in there would mean no going back. The rain started again, a soft drizzle at first, then heavier, until the streetlights blurred, the window glass fogged slightly. I kept thinking, Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is just business. Maybe. But then I saw it. His hand slid across the table, covering hers completely. He said something I couldn't hear, and she laughed, her head tilting toward him in a way that made my chest ache. It wasn't business, and it wasn't friendship. I stepped back, my shoes splashing in a shallow puddle, the sound louder than it should have been. My heart was hammering, my thoughts tangled. Part of me wanted to run inside and demand an explanation. Another part of me didn't want to hear it. Because sometimes, the moment you ask for the truth, it destroys you. I turned and walked away, the rain soaking through my jacket, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I just knew that whatever Daniel and I had been, it wasn't what I thought anymore. And on Unfaithful Chronicles, hear this from others too, that the night you see the truth with your own eyes is the night that the person you love becomes a stranger. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, hearing the rain still dripping against the window. My clothes were still damp from the walk back to my car, but I didn't have the energy to change. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, not just sitting in that restaurant, but leaning in toward her, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. That smile used to be mine. It wasn't anymore. By morning, my mind was a mess of half-formed thoughts. Do I call him? Pretend I don't know and see if he lies? Or do I just walk away? I wanted answers, and I was terrified of them. Around 8 a.m., my phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen. I let it ring. A minute later, a text appeared. "Hey, hope you slept well. Want to grab dinner tonight?" Dinner. After whatever last night was, he was already planning our next evening together like nothing had happened. And that's when I knew, if I didn't say something now, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering how many other nights there'd been. I called him back. My voice was steady, but my hands shook as I said, "We need to talk. My place, now." He showed up less than an hour later. Same warm smile, same easy charm. For a second, just a second, I almost forgot. I didn't waste time. "I saw you last night." The smile faltered, but only for a moment. Then came the chuckle, the head tilt. "Saw me where?" "At a restaurant," I said, "with a woman who isn't me." His eyes shifted, that same shift I'd seen when I asked questions he didn't want to answer. He ran a hand through his hair, sighed. "Claire, you've got it wrong. That's just a friend from work. We were talking about a project. It's nothing." Nothing. That word burned. I told him I saw the way he looked at her, the way he touched her hand. He said I was overreacting, that I'd read too much into it. Every excuse he gave only made it worse. Because it wasn't just about the woman. It was about every unanswered call, every night at work, every conversation he'd sidestepped until I stopped asking. Finally, I said it. The thing I'd been afraid to admit even to myself. "You're not the man I thought you were." Silence. For the first time since we'd met, Daniel had nothing to say. He left not long after. No fight, no begging me to believe him, just a quiet, almost relieved goodbye. And that hurt most of all. If you've never been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, it's been years since that night. I've moved on in some ways, but there are still moments, small quiet moments, when I catch myself holding back with people. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because I've learned how quickly "I love you" can turn into "you never knew me at all." If you're watching this, maybe you're in that in-between space right now where something feels off, but you're still telling yourself it's nothing. Listen to me. It's not nothing. Trust your gut, because the truth, it doesn't wait for permission to show itself. I wish I could tell you that the healing came quickly. That one morning I woke up, took a deep breath, and everything felt light again. But the truth? Healing felt less like flipping a switch and more like learning how to breathe underwater. For weeks after that night, I would wake up expecting to see their name on my phone. And sometimes I'd find myself reaching for it without even thinking, my thumb hovering over their contact. It's strange how habit feels like love until you pull it apart and see it for what it really is: dependency. There were moments when I hated them, and moments when I hated myself even more for not walking away sooner. I kept replaying the same scenes in my head, like my mind was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Every word they ever said, every moment they ever looked at me a certain way. I wondered if all of it had been rehearsed. The hardest part wasn't losing them. It was losing the person I thought I was when I was with them. I used to believe I was strong, someone who could spot a lie before it could hurt me. But when the truth finally came, I realized how many red flags I had quietly folded up and put in a drawer. Like the way they always turned their phone face down on the table, or how their friends would glance at each other when I mentioned certain stories, as if I didn't know the real version, or the way they would accuse me of things I hadn't done. Now I understand that was their way of distracting me from what they were doing. Those red flags weren't whispers, they were sirens, and I ignored them because I wanted to believe love could fix everything. But here's the thing I wish someone had told me. Love is not supposed to feel like a negotiation with your own worth. If you have to constantly justify why someone deserves another chance, they don't. The healing really began the night I decided not to check their social media anymore. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally accepted that what I was looking for, closure, was never going to come from them. Closure, I learned, isn't something someone gives you. It's something you decide for yourself. I started small, eating meals without my phone, going for walks in silence, letting my thoughts catch up to me without drowning them in noise. It wasn't comfortable at first, but slowly I began to remember who I was before them. I laughed at things that had nothing to do with them. I made plans without checking if they'd approve. I looked in the mirror and didn't see someone broken. I saw someone in the process of rebuilding. And maybe the most important lesson I learned is this: you can miss someone and still be glad they're gone. Because the truth is, that night didn't just end our relationship. It ended. I know it feels like your story is over, but it's not. It's just a chapter, and the pages ahead are blank, waiting for you to write something better. If you've seen yourself in my story, if you've recognized the same patterns, the same red flags, please share your story in the comments. Not just for me, but for the next person who stumbles across this video and needs to know they're not the only one. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, stories we often keep hidden until we realize someone else needs to hear them, make sure you subscribe. We're building a place here where truth is valued, where your voice matters, and where healing isn't something you have to do alone.